Right, time to make a video today. Let's talk about why time must be factored into utilitarianism. For those who don't know the basics of utilitarianism, it's the idea of the greater good, essentially, being an ethical model. So it takes consequences and says, what produces the most good for the most people is what should be done. And so, naturally, it's very different from a purely deontological model, like, say, you might hear from Immanuel Kant. But time should be factored in. Let's think about this for a second. Most people will be in the future. Like, if we count all the people on this planet and say all the people that will ever exist on this planet, tell me, when will more of them live? In the future or in the past? I mean, sure, there's been plenty of people in the past, but the future is where more will be because, well, if we produce, let's say, 1.5 children, and we have a population of 6 million, so 1.5 per woman, that's still easily more than the current population. And even if it goes down, as a 1.5 birth rate for all of humanity would result in, you still fundamentally will have more people in the future than the past because, well, there's more births, just net. Now, per capita births is different, but we're talking about the most people, not necessarily the most per person. And since more people will exist in the future, time must always be a factor. Because if you're doing the most good for the most people, and more people live in the future than especially now, much less the past, well then, in such a case, focusing on the future is what should be done. That is basic, taking the idea to its logical conclusion. Furthermore, short-term pleasure can often lead to long-term suffering. For example, heroin. Let's take that as an extreme example, but an effective one. Yes, heroin does, for the short term, feel good. That's why people take it. It's addictive. It feels great during the meantime because, it's a drug. That's what they do. But in the long term, it makes you want to freaking die. I thankfully can't speak from experience here, but there's a reason people OD on the thing. It's not a fun time by any stretch of the imagination. And in the long term, that is suffering, something a utilitarian who wishes to minimize that and try to produce the most good naturally cannot support. And so if you focus purely on short-term pleasure, you cannot truthfully prevent long-term suffering unless you are causing more people to suffer. That is literally the basics of reality. You must also remember, utilitarianism is about consequences. See, when it comes to policy, utilitarianism is consequentialist. It looks at consequences and determines right from there. Unlike deontology, which goes based on moral principles, do you align with these principles? If so, then moral. Utilitarianism does it based on consequences. And since consequences happen in the future, you must face forwards and look at that future. And of course, the longer in the future it is, the more and more things compound and the more a result is given. Now, there is always uncertainty. For example, let's use a historical example. After Alexander the Great died, there was no guarantee the Diadochi would carve up Greece as they did. There are plenty of chances for the Macedonians to unify, for Alexander's heirs to survive, for numerous things to happen. But they didn't. Fact is, things are not certain. Uncertainty is just a part of reality. You can make plays to try to guarantee certainty, but it can never fully be done. There is always some element of uncertainty in any future scenario, right? But you can still look ahead and say, okay, this will result in this, based on these numbers, and sure, we can be off a bit, but this is still better than the other alternatives. Ergo, it is what should be done. Under deontology, the basic principle is, this is right, this is wrong, therefore if it aligns, then it's good. If it doesn't align, then it's bad. And so you can afford to not care about time and place, because fundamentally it's about principle. If telling the truth is wrong in a deontological sense, or telling a lie is wrong, then it should not be done under any circumstance for any reason. Plain and simple. It does not matter what the cause would be. That said, with consequentialist reasoning, which utilitarianism is a branch off of, it does matter. The future is important. Therefore, you must factor in that future. Time must always be a consideration. If more people die because of an action, then it is a bad choice, a bad action. To give an extreme example, take an abortion. One may argue, well, if you let a baby die, then it's fine because, it's dead now. And it helps those who are still left. Small problem. That's going to be a person eventually, and that person can contribute to many more lives. Put this to a broader societal scale, and you're talking about millions of people who could be contributing to society. Even if we assume that because of financial constraints they have less kids overall, keeping those around will still generate more people to produce more work, which means more good can be produced. It increases the potential for good. And that means the greater good can be amplified further. The ability to produce labor is something that people have, and that is very critical when it comes to, the greater good. For example, this desk took people to make it. Maybe not a lot of people. It could have heavily relied on machinery to do so, but it still took people to do it. Same with this pen. At some point, labor is needed to produce a good. That's just how it is. Having more people helps with that, and in the long term, keeping more people around is useful for that exact purpose. Therefore, to preserve as many people as possible, which is the greater good mindset, is beneficial to the greater good. That is how it operates. One can argue, no. See, these people suffer, therefore, it is not. But just because someone suffers does not automatically mean that the greater good is being prevented. Because guess what? People are going to suffer even in the greater good. That is guaranteed because humanity is going to suffer, just as it's going to experience pleasure. Those things are inevitable in a long enough time frame. Think about it. If you have all pleasure all the time, you'll get bored of it. You won't feel it. It fundamentally will not give you pleasure anymore. A relationship that is hot for a long time will eventually become boring, monotonous. Why? Because that enjoyment that you initially have, eventually you get used to it. You get used to having that person around, to interact with that person. Eventually, it becomes standard, and thus not as pleasurable, if pleasurable at all. And so, naturally, there's also boredom and suffering. You cannot have eternal pleasure. You can only have short-term pleasure that surpasses the suffering and boredom in other periods. And you can focus on it in the long term. And you should focus on it in the long term. Suffering is inevitable, to some extent. But by having more people, you can derive more pleasure, joy, and other experiences. And thus, it is important to keep as many around as possible. Short-term utilitarianism, as already mentioned at least to some extent, is functionally hedonistic. It is purely pleasure for pleasure's sake. Good for good's sake. For example, someone steals your bike. Yeah, it's fine. They're probably just having fun with it. Does it matter? In the long term? Yes. But the hedonist, the short-term utilitarian, isn't thinking about things practically. No. They're thinking in terms of, how do I get the most good now? And thus consequences, the long-term ones, are going to hit them like a brick. And that's going to hurt them. But they don't care because they're focused on the short term. To argue for utilitarianism, and simultaneously argue for short-term thinking, is the most backwards thing you can do, short of arguing for a dog to become a cat. Or a cat to become a dog. It is utterly stupid to argue a consequentialist ethical model, a model derived from the long-term outcomes of a decision, should be judged in the short term. And importantly, people must exist in the future to preserve that which brings good. In order to have good, in order to have what is best, you need necessarily people to do it. A sentient and sapient being. Worth noting, sentient often refers to being capable of reason, but technically it just means experiencing emotions. I will get into that later. The fact that it has become, in common parlance, the same thing, but in practice is not, is a giant pain in the rear. And something that annoys me to some extent. But it is what it is. And when planning for utilitarian ethics, you must necessarily plan for people in the future, for long-term existence. To not do so is to welcome the essential collapse of the utilitarian function. Because remember, deontology is just a pure right and wrong. You can make a million arguments for why right is right and wrong is wrong. Right and wrong could be for any freaking reason. It really doesn't matter in deontology. Just that they are right and they are wrong. Once they are, it functions. You could have it literally exist with people dying out, and it still functions somewhat. So long as there's at least one person to observe it, you're fine. Excuse me. Consequentialism is different because it fundamentally relies on consequences for people, for entities that exist. And you need a moral agent in order to experience that. A cow will just do what cows do best. Eat, sleep, reproduce, get milked, and just exist. They won't have anything special planned. They won't care about pain or pleasure outside the immediate emotional responses they have. And things will just go on as they do. But you need people in a utilitarian ethical model because they are the ones who make the decisions for the greater good, because they have the capacity for reasoning. So long as there is a sapient being, we are clear. But we need that sapient being, and so we need people. And so any argument for utilitarianism that basically says screw the people is itself screwing itself. It cannot function under such situations. Utilitarianism is an ideology that relies upon, first and foremost, besides yawning apparently, the ability of a person to make a choice and a decision that will have consequences. That is fundamental to it. Utilitarianism cannot work without it. Why? Because when you're weighing the greater good, you need someone to tip the scales, to say, this is what produces the most good for the most people. You need that scale to be able to tip. And so you need people to practice and to act in accordance with that belief. Time must always be a factor. You cannot have a utilitarian system without it. That is how the world works, whether you like it or not. Have a good day. Thank you for watching.